I'm J.G. Michael, and this is Parallax Views. This edition of Parallax Views is brought to you by the $10 and above tier supporters of Parallax Views on Patreon. So, with that in mind, producers credit shoutouts to Galen, Matt, Gunnar, Mark, Simon, Alexander, Catherine, G, Tilo, Emilia, Jeremy, Jeff, John, Bert, Brian, Elliot, Michael, Brace, James, Nick, Mersham, Galen, Gareth, Arlen, Bo, Christopher, Michael, Gigadelic Media, Will, Chance, Chase, Dan, Big Bob, David H, Y. Kellerman, Sadeed 13, Kathleen, David, Ava, Bob, The West Bank Robbery Podcast, Jamie, Enoch, Gary, Max, Ishtofer, James, Martin, Matthew Ho, Brian, Nobody, Thomas, and Dano. And now on to the show. Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. As always, I want to remind you that if you support the work here I do at Parallax Views, please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. Again, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. I really could use your support as I try to release more shows this month, and, well, you're the ones keeping this afloat, because I am currently without any advertisers or sponsors, so it's you, the listener, that makes this show possible. So please, patreon.com/parallaxviews. Any amount will help. $1, $5, whatever you can afford. With that out of the way, we've got a really special show for you today. A guest is returning that I'm very, very happy to have on. I hold her in very high regard. Zaha Hassan of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Zaha has co-edited a new book that will be the subject of our discussion today, entitled Suppressing Dissent, Shrinking Civic Space, Transnational Repression, and Palestine, Israel. And also joining us for this discussion is a first-time guest on this program and a contributor to the aforementioned book. Youssef Munier is a senior fellow at the Arab Center, Washington, D.C., and he'll be discussing his contribution to Suppressing Dissent, a piece entitled Closing Spaces Beyond Borders, Israel's Transnational Repression Network. So, with all that being said, let's get right to the conversation with Zaha Hassan and Youssef Munier. Welcome to Parallax Views. Two guests I'm very happy to be speaking with. One, a returning guest who I hold in very, very high esteem, Zaha Hassan at the Carnegie Endowment, and another guest, Youssef Munier, who I've wanted to have on this show, and I'm so glad we could finally get him. And they're both contributors to a new book that is fascinating to me, and I think a very important read, especially at this time. It's called Suppressing Dissent, Shrinking Civic Space, Transnational Repression, and Palestine, Israel, edited by Zaha Hassan and Isham Helier. How are you both doing?
Good, thanks.
Thanks for having us.
So, right off the bat, I think the first thing we should address is, in light of this book, it seems very relevant, the detainment of Mahmoud Khalil. Could you speak to that? I don't know if you want to go first, Zaha, or Youssef.
I'll jump right in. We don't know a whole lot. This is just unfolding in real time right now. Mahmoud Khalil was a student at Columbia University and very much engaged in the student activism and protests surrounding the genocidal assault on Gaza, calling for a ceasefire. He was also involved in negotiations with the administration around the encampment that was set up at Columbia University. He was apparently taken a few days ago from his home in the evening, told that he was going to have his student visa revoked. Then it was, that he explained that he doesn't have a student visa. He's a green card holder, and still was taken as a green card holder, permanent resident of the United States, and transferred by ICE outside of the state of New York, where he resided, to Louisiana, held in a detention center. And it wasn't quite so clear exactly what the legal basis was going to be for why he was being detained and ultimately for him to be removed from the country. The latest we understand is that it's because he, according to the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, poses a danger to the United States because of foreign policy concerns. So that's the legal basis in immigration. There's an immigration statute that concerns this as a grounds for removal from the United States. So that's what we know. So essentially, his pro-Palestine advocacy is seen as a foreign policy threat to the United States. And so that is why he's been removed. Or that's why he's being held pending removal. So far, the federal court in New York has told the administration that it's not allowed to move him out of the country, pending he has certain due process rights. He also happens to have free speech rights in the United States as an immigrant to the country. But that doesn't seem to matter much at the moment. And that's where we stand.
Yeah, if I could just jump in here to add a few things. I mean, I think the most important thing about Khalil's case so far that we know is that he was detained without any charge. He's not being charged at this time with any sort of, criminal charge. And nonetheless, he was detained by state agents, in this case, ICE, taken from his home, taken from his family, and effectively disappeared for a period of time. His family and his attorneys had no idea where he was. He was moved from one immigration detention facility in New Jersey to another one 1,000 miles away in Louisiana, presumably because the state agents believe that holding him there in Louisiana, if this ultimately went before an immigration judge, would put him in a district where they would have a more favorable ruling. And in fact, in the court proceedings that are taking place in New York, the state is arguing that, this should be heard in Louisiana, not in New York. And so there was a clear sort of agenda here to try to move him very quickly from one place to another. Again, no charges have been made against him. So this is one thing. The other thing that I would point out, which I think is very important, is the very personal nature of this attack by the highest levels of American government on a student activist, which is something that I think is pretty unprecedented and pretty chilling. I don't know of any similar case where the President of the United States has really singled out the name and image of a student activist to bring down the power of the U.S. government against them, let alone a president like Donald Trump, who, of course, as we know, has used his platform to mobilize a violent insurrection against the American government previously. So it's a deeply, deeply chilling thing to see. And at the same time, this is being done with the promise from the government to do much more of this, to target many more students, many more activists that they say are visa holders. Of course, in this case, we're not talking about a visa holder. We're talking about a lawful permanent resident, a green card holder. And it's really part and parcel of a broader effort to attack the immigration system and immigrants altogether, something that has been an agenda of the Trump administration. And the last point I will make on Khalil's case, and this perhaps will transition us to other issues that we can talk about here today and are so central to the book. This is but the latest escalation in a long-running series of events which have used the issue of Palestine to chip away at free speech and First Amendment protected activity here in the United States. Absent any real organized values-based pushback against these kinds of efforts, we should only expect this to escalate and not stay limited to issues around Palestine.
In that regard, I wanted to ask, and then we'll talk about the bigger themes of the book. What do you make of the reactions to this latest story? I've seen a lot of pushback, when it comes to this detainment. What do you make of it? Is the sort of pushback against it a good sign? I'm trying to find a silver lining, I guess.
It's interesting because there's been pushback and there's been some silence. And the pushback I've been noting, has been coming from, very important Democratic leadership, and of course, civil society organizations that are concerned about this particular case, but also about the fact that, this administration has promised that this is just the beginning. And, as we'll talk about later, Palestinians and the Palestinian issue tends to become the canary in the coal mine for things that come later. So if you want to test out, have a pilot of some measure to see whether it can pass muster, you use this issue. You use Palestinians, you use immigrants. In this case, you have both. You have a Palestinian who's a legal permanent resident at stake. So I think a lot of people are concerned because of this, because of what it might mean. We've already seen this administration really take some shocking and unprecedented actions writ large. It's been focused as well on academic institutions because, as it was stated by the White House, these are viewed as left-leaning and un-American institutions, and so I think we should also look at it as an attack on academic institutions. And so because of that reason, people are quite concerned because of what this means for academic freedom, what it means for free speech. So you're seeing all kinds of different civil society actors come out, but also folks in the Democratic Party. But there's also been silence. And the ones who've been silent have been sort of academic institutions themselves, the administrators. The stakes are super high with respect to this particular issue because we've already seen Columbia University lose $400 million in grants and contracts because it's perceived by this White House as not doing enough to come down on pro-Palestinian speech on campus. There is, other action that's being threatened against institutions who have been named by this White House. 60 colleges and universities have been named as, justifying scrutiny. So I think there's a lot of intimidation of college administrators. They're concerned about, losing their funding, their federal funding, but also they're concerned about discrimination suits and scrutiny from the Department of Education around their policies as they relate to protest on campus.
Yeah, if I could, just let me add to that a little bit. Zaha is absolutely right about Palestinians being the canary in the coal mine, and I want to just talk a little bit about why that is. Palestinians as a political community here in the United States may be among the most vulnerable political communities that exist here in the United States, particularly when you consider what they are up against in terms of the political strength of adversaries here in the United States within the pro-Israel community that are targeting them with all kinds of efforts to police their activism, police their speech, what have you. And so that's a very slanted deck, right? And so the number of people within the political space that are willing to throw down with Palestinians are much less than those who would throw down with other minority groups, precisely because of what may come against them for speaking up or for speaking out. And here I just want to say that this is precisely how these sort of repressive episodes expand, right? You begin with a target that is the easiest target, right? You begin with a community that is the easiest community, the one that not many people are going to stand up for. And, the people who are wrestling with this question about what to say, what to do, should I stand in solidarity with this victim? One of the questions that they're wrestling with is, well, okay, this is a Palestinian, this is an immigrant. They're really not going to come for me, right? That's probably where they'll stop. They can't really conceivably come for me next, or a citizen next, or a big institution next, right? And in the process, the values and norms that protect all of us are being weakened, right? And the next step is to go after the next group or the next person. And this continues to play out until you have a snowball effect. And next thing you know, the normalization of state power being abused in this politically repressive way is suddenly all around us, right? And at that point, when you do speak up, if you do speak up, it's far too late.
Zaha, if I could ask you, what are the origins of this book? Because it was written, or it started at least. The project started with you and Dr. Hellier before October 7th. So what were the origins of this examination of the shrinking civic space when it comes to Israel-Palestine?
Well, as Yusuf mentioned, I mean, this is a long story, right? This idea of, it being incredibly fraught to talk about Israel-Palestine in the United States just because of the political interests that are involved. But in particular, it was after May 2021 when there was an escalation in Jerusalem that was during Ramadan. And there was, this was a moment in which you had the refugee issue come together with questions around the right to worship and, the Palestinian right to live free in Jerusalem come together at this one moment in time. And there was an incredible amount of activism on the ground to push back against the eviction of families from Jerusalem and the right for Palestinians to be able to access their holy sites and worship during Ramadan. And it was a moment where Palestinians inside of the occupied territories also became active with Palestinian citizens of Israel and joined together in what they called a unity intifada uprising to push back against Israeli policies. And there was also, at the same time, an international sort of outcry and activism online and elsewhere to raise awareness about what was happening. There was a lot of social media activism going on. And so this generated, because of how coordinated and how effective the civil society actors were in this particular moment, there was a lot of pushback as well, a lot of online censorship, a lot of repressive measures being taken against Palestinians, both inside the occupied territories and inside of Israel. There was also violence from private actors and use of mechanisms by private actors to target Palestinian citizens of Israel and to attack Palestinians in the occupied territories. So, we noted all of these developments, both in terms of sort of the power of civil society, but also the backlash that it faced. And we thought this was an important subject to dive deeper into. It was also a moment where there was a lot of activity by the Israeli government to quash civil society organizations that were seeking accountability against Israel for human rights violations. We noted the use of Pegasus software on human rights defenders. And
That was the spyware, right?
That's the spyware that it was used by Israel on the technology belonging to some of those who were involved in the International Criminal Court case against Israeli officials. And actually, it was the discovery of that software or that hacking of the phones of Palestinian human rights defenders that led Israel to designate the organizations that they belong to as terrorist organizations. So all of this was happening, all of these attacks on civil society actors and civil society organizations. And we wanted to explore this and to find out sort of what is it going to mean for the future of a just peace between Israelis and Palestinians. What's it going to mean in terms of the ability of Palestinians to advocate on their own behalf for a different future? And we wanted to know what was the connection between what was going on abroad and sort of the restrictions on speech that we're seeing in the United States and elsewhere around the globe, both, in terms of speech on campus and workplaces, but also online, the censorship and the deplatforming and things of that nature. So, but that's essentially what brought us together as a group. And I think this project that resulted in this book was a project that involves around 30 people, experts, subject matter experts in all kinds of different fields, but looking specifically at the different legal mechanisms that are being used to silence pro-Palestinian speech and activism around the world.
Real quick, if I could, I just wanted to thank you for mentioning the Pegasus spyware story and the NSO group that created that software, because I know a lot of people that are familiar with the Pegasus saga, but I think sometimes how it was used against Palestinian civil society is maybe glossed over, or people just don't know about it. I mean, this was technology that was used against journalists in Mexico that were reporting on the cartels. It was used against human rights activists all over the world, but it was definitely used against Palestinians. So I appreciate your mentioning that story.
Well, it wasn't just used against them, it was tested and perfected on Palestinians first. I mean, Palestine, as Anthony Lowenstein mentions, is
the
a
Palestine laboratory.
Yeah, the Palestine laboratory. So Palestinians have become the lab creatures for all kinds of surveillance and high-tech tools of violence.
And if I could just jump in here on this bit, Pegasus is one of many different spyware softwares that come out of Israel. And these are effectively defense intelligence products. So they are created and licensed for export by the Israeli Ministry of Defense, which works very closely with its military industry that is staffed largely by ex-military intelligence personnel. There's an entire unit of Israeli military intelligence that is quite well known for transitioning from the military intelligence space straight into the private sector of industry that creates some of these very notorious spyware products that, as you note, Pegasus is included among them, but of course there are others like Paragon, which was recently exposed as a spyware being used by the Italian government to spy on activists across Europe and journalists across Europe. And so, this is kind of a recurrent theme, and as noted, it's Palestinians who are, having these kinds of technologies tested on them first and most directly by Israeli military intelligence itself, who then go on to create and market and proliferate these kinds of surveillance technologies across the world for use by a wide range of bad actors, including governments that are implicated in some pretty serious human rights abuses.
Youssef, if you could, I was very interested in speaking with you about your contribution to the book, Closing Spaces Beyond Borders, Israel's Transnational Repression Network. And you talk a lot there about the Ministry of Strategic Affairs, which has sort of morphed into, to my understanding, the Ministry of Diaspora Affairs in Israel, and how there is this sort of laid out plan to quell dissent when it comes to speech around Israel-Palestine. Could you take us through that?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for the question. My chapter was focused on trying to understand and trace how, as a matter of Israeli government policy, they went about addressing the challenge of global dissent from civil society. And in the chapter, I traced the evolution of this in Israeli policy circles, from where it becomes an idea to the point where it becomes a directive from the Israeli Prime Minister's office, and then embodied within the government through the formation of a specific ministry tasked with the objective of combating dissent within global civil society. This became, housed in something called the Ministry of Strategic Affairs. It's got this kind of ambiguous name, and it has morphed over time into being an objective that's housed under different ministries, whether it's the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and now most recently under something called the Ministry of Diaspora and Combating Anti-Semitism. But I think the important part is less about the specific agencies within the Israeli government that were doing this work, and more about the policy and the strategy in particular. And this was born out of a reality within Israeli policy circles that understood that Israel was largely losing a narrative battle globally. And the narrative battle was essentially that Israel's treatment of the Palestinians was unjustified. Israel's policies towards Palestinians were unjustified. And the narrative, of course, that Israel would like to see sort of dominate is that Israel's policies towards the Palestinians are justified. Israel is on the defensive, its actions are legitimate. When it restricts Palestinian rights, it's doing so because it's necessary, and so on and so forth. But that's not the prevailing narrative, I think, anymore globally. Recognizing this, the Israeli government took steps to address this, not by seeking to change the narrative by defending their policies, but instead to prevent the narrative from evolving further by attacking critics of Israeli policy around the world. And the sort of the slogan that this was done under within Israeli policy circles and in the government was shifting from defense to offense. In other words, it was no longer sufficient to defend Israeli policies. Now the government had to go on the offensive against those who were criticizing Israeli policy. And this took all kinds of shapes over time. And the targets of this action was anything from college students boycotting hummus at the local co-op, to members of Congress who were seeking to pass resolutions to condition aid to Israel, and everything in between. And so this was sort of the origin of this, and I tried to trace throughout my chapter why they made these decisions, and then how they went about implementing them, and who they partnered with to achieve these outcomes.
One thing I wanted to talk about is early on in the book, there's two chapters by previous guests on this show, Nathan J. Brown and Dana L. Kurd, about Oslo and the sort of long shadow of Oslo. How important is it to understand uh, the aftermath of the Oslo Accords, of the Oslo framework, in regards to what we have seen since?
So, I mean, if you think about um, civil society and how critical it is to Palestinians in terms of maintaining them on the land, in terms of maintaining their resistance to being displaced and evicted, um, is absolutely critical. Palestinian civil society organizations, predate the Palestinian Authority. They were the ones providing social services under occupation. They were the ones who were, really maintaining Palestinian sumud, or steadfastness, on the land. So when Oslo was signed, all of a sudden you had a new institution that was coming in that was supposed to be representative of Palestinians, provide them with what services you imagine any government would be responsible for. And so that the emergence of this new body, this new institution, really sidelined a bit the Palestinian civil society organizations that were taking on really almost the role of a government in some aspects. But it was also these civil society organizations, as I said, were also acting as a bulwark of resistance to Israeli occupation. But also the Palestinian Authority was coming in as a partner with Israel in terms of a peace partner, but also a security partner. And the mission of the Palestinian Authority was very different than the civil society organizations that existed on the ground, because they were looking to work with Israel, getting to an end of occupation and to statehood, but working with Israel in that regard. So the entire framework for the Palestinian Authority was one that was in some ways in opposition to these civil society organizations. And actually, a lot of civil society evolved a bit because of the disincentivizing of Palestinian resistance by donors that came in and wanted to fund peace efforts. So there was money flowing to NGOs and those that in particular were supporting normalization and peace, quote unquote peace efforts, and a very much a marginalization of those organizations that were still engaged in resistance, engaged in supporting communities in particular that were very vulnerable because they were in parts of the occupied territories that the Palestinian Authority didn't have jurisdiction over. So still providing healthcare, still providing agricultural support, all kinds of things that a government normally is responsible for. But because the Palestinian Authority's jurisdiction was very limited, they were still engaged. And there were also Palestinian civil society organizations engaged in documenting human rights violations and pursuing accountability. Those stood parallel to and sometimes in opposition with the Palestinian Authority. So this was the period after Oslo that was inherited. And just to give some context to your listeners, the nature of occupation is one in which the very notion of self-determination is in opposition. After Israel occupied the West Bank and Gaza, including Jerusalem, East Jerusalem, it started banning any political activity. So like 400 Palestinian organizations were banned and labeled terrorist organizations. Every single Palestinian faction is banned. You cannot gather more than three people together without that being a violation of military regulations. So all political activity is in opposition to an occupation. So, but that was and continues to be the reality in the occupied territories. So these organizations exist in a very inhospitable environment, to say the least. But it wasn't just after Oslo and after the Palestinian Authority was created. It wasn't just against the occupation. These organizations were resisting. In a lot of ways, they were resisting the entire framework of Oslo and the Palestinian Authority because of how contradictory it was to have these organizations exist while Oslo was meant to mask the occupation and prolong it. It wasn't actually ever built for purpose, which was to end the occupation. And so these organizations ended up dealing with layers of restrictions and harassment from not just the occupying authorities, but also from the Palestinian Authority in many cases. And so the different chapters that you were referencing really look at sort of this history of how Oslo became sort of this another layer for Palestinian civil society in resisting the occupation and how it complicates their work. The maintenance of the Oslo framework complicates their work. And I guess I'll stop there so that I can give Yusuf an opportunity.
Yeah, I think the other important piece of the Oslo context to the bigger question of sort of global activism is if you think back to the genesis of what became known as the Oslo Accords. This is taking place in the early 1990s, and it's taking place in a moment of great transformation and people power transformation around the globe. The Berlin Wall comes down. The Soviet Union is collapsing. You have this wave of democratization in countries across Eastern Europe. You have apartheid ending in South Africa. And on the Palestine front, you have an intifada. You have an uprising of Palestinians on the ground demanding freedom. And this was largely driven by individuals, civil society actors, protesters out in the streets. And in come the Oslo Accords, which is a state-driven effort, right? And is effectively these powerful states, the United States and other countries, saying, we, leaders of the international community, we've got this. We are going to carry this forward to a peaceful resolution. Here's the pathway. It's these Oslo Accords. And the idea is that at the end of this, there will be Palestinian self-determination. They affix initially a 5-year deadline to it. So you should have an end to these accords in 1999. But what became clear over time is that that was always a false promise. Right? Even for the people who placed their faith in the Oslo Accords and those who were kind of promoting it, whether on the Palestinian, Israeli, or the American front, it absolutely failed to deliver. And what became clear is that actually the international system, because of the role of the United States, and particularly its support for Israel, was not going to deliver for Palestinians their self-determination. And because of the failure of the Oslo Accords, it fell once again on global civil society to become the engine of change for policy on Palestine. And it is no coincidence that you see the rise of global civil society activism on Palestine immediately after the collapse of the Oslo Accords.
If I could, Zaha, with regards to the Israeli occupation, has this in any way affected, um, does the occupation have an interplay with the internal governance in Gaza and the West Bank? I know in one part of your chapter, you talk about how NGOs operating in Gaza are also subject to monitoring from the de facto authority of Gaza, Hamas. Is there an interplay between the occupation and also just the ways in which there's heavy surveillance and heavy monitoring in the occupied areas?
Yeah, I mean, you think about, a community living under occupation, and one of the strategies that Israel has deployed, and it's generally deployed by colonial powers writ large, but the aim is to turn societies against each other and to try to use members of societies as collaborators and figure out ways to uh, force them, blackmail, usage, or in other mechanisms. Because they're a vulnerable community, there are many ways in which they can do this. So it makes the society very on guard all the time, makes people worried about who they're talking to and what they're sharing. And we of course have now in the last decade to worry about hacking on phones and all kinds of surveillance tools. So this has created a real sort of caged feeling in the occupied territories. People feel like they're always being surveilled. Their conversations are always being listened to. And it's true, they are. I mean, if you think about the number of cameras that exist just in the one city of Hebron, it's absolutely amazing. You see cameras all over the place surveilling Palestinians. But on top of that, you have the hacking on the phones and that kind of constant sense that you're being listened to and surveilled. And so yes, in the occupied territories, in particular in Gaza, where it is completely a prison sort of feeling, there's a lot of concern by the de facto authority there about those who might be collaborators, those who might be compromised by the occupation, and they respond very brutally when they come across someone who they suspect is a collaborator. And so there is, violations of human rights inside of Gaza against Palestinians, on Palestinians, or by Palestinians. So that's, we discussed that a bit in the chapter. In the West Bank, it's a little bit different. There, the ways in which the Palestinian Authority is infringing on the rights of their own citizens is generally because they're trying to clamp down on protest that they know that is critical of the PA's continued role in being the security contractor for Israel, or they're concerned about protest that is aimed at exposing the corruption of Palestinian Authority officials, or other malfeasance of Palestinian Authority officials. And so that the nature of the Palestinian on Palestinian assaults on civil liberties and attacks are a bit different than what you see inside Gaza.
Yusuf, I wanted to ask you, what do you think the main mechanisms being used to suppress dissent are? I mean, I know in the book there's a lot of talk about the IHRA sort of redefinition of anti-Semitism. We could talk about that, but are there any other mechanisms you think people really need to understand are being used in a way to suppress dissent that what are the most important ones that we should be pointing out?
Well, I think there's a whole host of them, right? And some of them are very direct, some of them are indirect, some of them involve state agents, like we saw in the case of Mahmoud Khalil, and I think we're going to see a lot more of that moving forward. Some of them involve legal activity like lawfare, civil suits. Others are done sort of in the public sphere, like smear campaigns, where the reputations of individuals are smeared publicly so that they'll either be fired from their jobs or not be able to find a job or face some other kind of punitive measures within their communities or places of work. And then you have the stuff that we don't see, but we are sure is happening in one form or another, which involves the more covert stuff, the surveillance. We talked a little bit about spyware, phishing attacks, and the surveillance and stalking of activists, which we have seen in certain cases over time. So there's a wide range. I should also mention deplatforming, which is basically shutting down the platforms of civil society actors, either to have access to social media so that they can get the word out about the things that they care about, or to shut down access to their bank accounts so that they simply cannot operate as a entity anymore. And we've seen a number of cases of both banks closing down accounts in certain places, and also other funding relationships being ended because of these campaigns that target them. So there's really a wide range of different ways in which this type of coercion takes place. A number of them are identified in the chapter that I wrote and also elsewhere in the book.
Do you want to add to that at all, Zaha? And if you could, I know we've used this term, Palestinian civil society organizations. If people aren't familiar with what that means, like, are you able to give any examples?
Yeah, sorry, I should have done that at the top. So basically, civil societies, everything that's not government really, but it's your associations, your unions, basically anything that isn't your government or political parties is your civil society. It can even include, private sector businesses and such. So, but there are certain organized community-based organizations and human rights defenders and those kinds of things that we focused on in the book because of how essential they are to Palestinian resistance to their displacement and to continuing apartheid practices in the occupied territories. I would like to add a little bit to what Yusuf said, just focusing on Palestinian civil society and sort of what mechanisms they face. They're pretty much the same mechanisms, really, but they're of a different quality, obviously, because people are living under occupation. One thing I mentioned already is that Israel has been designating, whereas they focused on more political activity before as a basis for designating or for outlawing organizations. In the last few years, they've been designating human rights organizations and community-based organizations providing essential services in the parts of the West Bank where the Palestinian Authority doesn't have jurisdiction. They've also been detaining and harassing the staff and the leaders of these organizations. And, they just take them and hold them indefinitely for periods of time, which obviously impacts the ability of these organizations to do their work and to document human rights violations. We've seen the use of travel bans against the members of these organizations, and even against staff who are dual citizens of the United States and have Palestinian IDs. So we've seen this phenomenon happening, and we haven't seen much pushback by the State Department in that, these are U.S. citizens that are being prevented from leaving or returning sometimes back to the occupied territories. We've seen the attacks on their offices, the taking of their client files. Some of these organizations are legal organizations that represent clients. They've had their files taken. And of course, there's surveillance and hacking. And as I mentioned earlier, some of these staff at these organizations have been subjected to NSO software being found on their phone. And again, related to their work around seeking accountability at the International Criminal Court. But really most detrimental to on top of all of this is really the impact it's having on their ability to continue operating when they have their bank accounts at risk. A lot of these organizations, particularly those that are doing human rights defense and seeking an accountability, they rely on money from outside. They get money from other international organizations or foundations that are trying to support the human rights work that they do. But when Israel labels them a terrorist organization and engages in a smear campaign and a whispering campaign abroad about them, it makes donors very discouraged, to say the least, about sending money abroad because they worry about their own legal risk. Or it just simply takes time for them to verify that these organizations are legitimate and that that the allegations being made against them are spurious. And so it can delay funding. Many organizations have told me that because of the smear campaigns that Yusuf mentioned, that corresponding banks that they have to go through for transfers from abroad won't transfer the money, even though they haven't been adjudged to be engaged in a kind of criminal activity. The banks just don't want the legal risk of transferring funds through their systems to abroad, so they just simply don't do it. And so this makes it very difficult, excuse me, for these organizations to get predictably, funding into their accounts. And so it makes their operations very challenging. It also means that it's hard for them to keep staff because staff need to be paid. They have families, they have bills to pay, and if they can't rely on regular salaries from their organization, they'll find somewhere else to work. They have to find somewhere else to work, and so they lose really qualified staff because of the ways in which these smear campaigns and these terror designations impact their ability to receive funds.
And I would just add to that while Palestinian organizations in particular are probably the most targeted and the most vulnerable, it's not limited to Palestinian organizations at all. We've seen international human rights organizations being targeted in one way or another, either having their staff denied entry or surveilled or what have you because of the statements that they've made in relation to Israeli policy. We've seen Jewish organizations who have taken a critical position on Israeli policy be targeted as well, including groups in Europe that have had their bank accounts shut down and others who've been put on lists and so on and so forth. We see a wide range of groups that are being affected by this. Recently, we've even seen, the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court sanctioned by the United States government, in very large part because of his indictment of Israeli officials for war crimes. These are all different kinds of actors that are being targeted with some form of coercive measures to prevent them from taking any actions that are critical of Israeli policy.
Before we wrap up, I just had one or two more questions. I noticed that Dalia Shindlin, the Israeli pollster, had a contribution in the book, and it made me want to ask about this because I know there's a lot of discussion around it. But what is the role that both American Jews and even Jewish voices in Europe, as well as even Israelis like Dalia Shindlin or activists in Israel, can have when it comes to these discussions about Palestine and being an ally to the Palestinian movement?
Exactly. So you want me to start? Look, I think, we're not going to be able to get to a peaceful, just resolution to what's the situation in Israel, Palestine without Palestinians and Israeli Jews being able to resist together the current situation. And so I firmly believe in co-resistance. What that looks like and what it means is being debated.
Yeah, I mean, what I would say here is I think that an important factor is that the policies of the Israeli state, including policies which are horrific in terms of the way that they treat Palestinians and are widely sort of reviled around the world, are repeatedly being legitimized by the Israeli state as steps that they need to take to defend the Jewish people. And so Jewish identity in one way or another is repeatedly being used as a way to defend the abuse of Palestinians. And so, if you are a person of conscience who happens to be Jewish and understands that what is happening is wrong, there's a whole list of reasons for you to oppose this and to object to your identity being used as a defense for these kinds of policies. We see this not only in the way that it's used to sort of legitimize the abuses against Palestinians, but also in the ways in which speech for Palestine is targeted here in the United States and elsewhere through the use of definitions of anti-Semitism that seek to turn criticism of Israel and its policies into, illegal and taboo statements. And for, people who understand the dangers of attacking free speech and attacking civil liberties and the history of those kinds of steps and what they've meant for minorities like the Jewish people and others over time, they are, outraged over the fact that their identity and their safety, right, is being used as a weapon to attack the safety and the rights of others. So I think that also has a lot to do with this dynamic.
I know we couldn't cover everything in this conversation, but just before we close here, is there anything that I missed that you think is very important to point out right now? I mean, we could have talked about any number of topics, whether it's how U.S. counterterrorism law is used against Palestinian voices, or even this stuff with Meta. For people that don't know, Meta has actually been caught using algorithms to suppress Palestinian voices. So all of this is in the book. Is there anything I missed, though, that you feel is particularly important to point out right now? Do you want to start, Youssef, and then Zaha?
I mean, I think we've covered a good bit of ground, and at the same time, we could talk about this for hours. I really appreciate you, giving us the opportunity to do that. The one point that I think I would add to what we've covered so far is that while this is an attack that has largely been driven by the right in the United States and in Europe and elsewhere, it's had a lot of allies across the political spectrum who have helped move these repressive policies forward. And while Palestine is often the target, it never stays there. And once these policies of repression become legitimized as tools to silence dissent on Palestine, they will quickly be used for other items on the right-wing agenda. And we've seen instances of this, where anti-boycott laws that were designed, for example, to target boycotts against Israel are being used to target boycotts against fossil fuel companies, are being used to target boycotts against gun manufacturers, and so on and so forth. And so while this may start with Palestine, it certainly will not end there.
Yeah, we have this thing that we say when we talk about the book, which is that, what happens in Palestine doesn't stay in Palestine. It does tend to be the blueprint, as Yusuf said. And so we should all be concerned about it.
Zaha, I just had one more question for you. I promise to let you go after this, but I first had you on because I was really impressed by the piece you co-wrote with Daniel Levy and a few others in 2021, Breaking the Israel-Palestine Status Quo, where you advocated a new U.S. approach that should prioritize protecting the rights and human security of Palestinians and Israelis over maintaining a peace process and attempting short-term fixes. That was 2021. We're in 2025 now. Has anything changed with how you think the U.S. should be approaching these matters?
I mean, the rights-based approach for me is not, it's not about a feel-good sort of let's do the moral thing. It's really also about getting to a place where we can have the right environment for a durable peace. If anything was proven from that report, which Yusuf was very much involved in as well, it was that, we are dealing with a situation in which we've been kicking the can down the road with respect to Israel-Palestine, and we predicted in that report, and it's not rocket science. But if you do that, if you continue to kick the can down the road, continue to allow and provide political, legal, and financial cover for expansion of settlements, for human rights violations across the occupied territories, there's going to be an explosion, literally and figuratively. And we saw that. I don't think we expected, obviously, the scale and the devastation that came on October 7th and in its aftermath. But the idea that there would be violent resistance, we very much anticipated if actions weren't taken quickly and there wasn't a committed and sustained engagement to help change the political calculations of the parties involved. And so I take no pleasure in saying that, we told you so back then. But I think that the premise of that report stands, that we need to center rights in figuring out how to get to a just resolution. What that resolution looks like is, up for debate. One state, two state, confederation. That's not so much the issue. The issue is whether or not both Palestinians and Israelis can live with equal dignity in that small slither of land between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River.
I think that's a great note to end on. I want to thank you both for coming on Parallax Views. And I should have noted right at the top of this, the book Suppressing Dissent is available at the Carnegie Endowment website. I believe the ebook version is free, right, Zaha? Can you tell my listeners about that?
Yes, so you can download it for free. It's an open access book, or you could purchase it and it's available in any, platform, bookseller platform.
Thank you again both for coming on Parallax Views.
Thanks.
Thanks for having
Yusuf.
us.
Well, that does it for this edition of Parallax Views. I hope you enjoyed the conversation with Zaha Hassan and Yusuf Munier. As always, if you appreciate the work here I do at Parallax Views, please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. And with that being said, Until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. If nothing else, if we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.